Hello, Mishpacha, it's Courtney, America's Jewish mother. Welcome back to my channel. Steve Donahue has read more books than you. He's also read more books than I have. That is his whole brand. So I'm here today to do the a book Steve hasn't read tag. So this was originally created by Matthew at Mayberry Book Club, but it originally made the rounds back when I was still lurking on BookTube and before I actually started a channel of my own. But it has recently been revived by Daniel at Guilty Feet, and Mark Nash has also weighed in. So I'm gonna throw my hat into the ring and we're gonna see what happens. Now, absolutely, I do have some books on my shelf that I am positively confident Steve Donahue has not read because they're like so niche. So for example, Inspired Jewish Leadership, Practical Approaches to Building Strong Communities by Dr. Erica Brown. This was a book that I got when I went to a retreat, a Union for Reform Judaism retreat for synagogue presidents a few years ago. So this is not published by a mainstream press, it's published by Jewish Lights, you know, so this is too niche, right? But you know, whatever, like for sure I have like these kinds of books that are like so, you know, completely niche that there's no way that Steve would have read them. But the goal of this is to pick books that Steve might have read, but maybe he didn't read them. So I'm gonna link Matthew's original version of this, and then also Daniel at Guilty Feet and Mark Nash's more recent versions of this down below. And I'm going to take a page from Mark Nash's book, and I've divided my list into fiction and nonfiction, although fiction is more like fiction and poetry. So let's go. So the first book on my list is a backlisted title from Anzia Yezierska. Now, I am quite sure that Steve has read Anzia Yezierska's short story collection, Hungry Hearts, because it's a Penguin edition and he owns every single Penguin book ever. So I'm sure he's read Hungry Hearts. I'm also quite sure that he's read Anzia Yezierska's novel, Bread Givers, which is her most famous book. He may even have read her novel, Salome of the Tenements, because I think that had a re-release in the mid-90s. But the book I want to know if Steve Donahue has read is one that I read while working on my chapter on Yezierska for my dissertation, which is her 1932 novel, All I Could Never Be. This is a fictionalized account of Anzia Yezierska's experience working as a translator for John Dewey and Albert C. Barnes's ethnographic study of a Polish community in Philadelphia where the immigrants resisted assimilation. And her main character in this novel, Fania, is quite critical of the Dewey-esque character Henry Scott for studying the Polish immigrants as if they were like specimens in a lab and also kind of thinking of them as a monolith. So Steve, have you read All I Could Never Be? Second book in the poetry and prose category is Harryette Mullen's Recyclopedia. This was published in 2006. It collects several of Harryette Mullen's previous volumes. Now, her earliest volume, Tree Tall Woman, was published in, I think, 1983, and it's out of print right now. Like, I can't even get hold of it. But her next 3 volumes have all been collected in this volume. So those are Trimmings, Supermarket, and Muse and Drudge. And I actually have used this book to write a scholarly article on Harryette Mullen, which actually just recently got back a revise and resubmit from a journal, so that's exciting. So I'm going to be working on that over the next month. So Steve, have you read Harryette Mullen? Next book is one that I just DNF'd yesterday, and this is a book that I got for the 2021 Reading Women Challenge, which is Ghada al-Samman's Farewell Damascus, translated by Nancy Roberts. So I believe this book was published in English in 2017, and it looks like it was originally published in 2015. So this was to fulfill the Reading Women Challenge prompt to read an Arab author in translation. And I got to the halfway point of this book, and I had to DNF because it was just really bad. It was really badly written. And I will talk more about this in my Friday Reads in April reading wrap-up. But yeah, Steve, I suspect that you haven't read this because I think if you had, it would have gone in your recent 20 questions tag where you were asked about the worst book you've ever read, and you said The Love Letter. You said that was the worst book written here or anywhere. I'm gonna one-up you. This is actually the worst book. So have you read it? Next one I have is more poetry, and this is one that I think Steve may actually have read. It is The Galloping Hour, French Poems by Alejandra Pizarnik. So Pizarnik had an interesting life. She was born in Argentina, and she was educated in Spanish and Yiddish, and wrote a lot of poetry, and she died relatively young. So this volume was published in, I believe, 2018, and it collects poems that she wrote in French, and it's bilingual, so it gives you, one page with the French, one page with the English. Now, I will say this was not a volume I particularly liked, but Steve, have you read it? My next book is Sarah Phillips by Andrea Lee. This is not a collection I've ever heard anyone talk about before. So this was originally published in 1984, and it is a series of interconnected short stories about the title character, Sarah Phillips, who basically is a member of the African-American upper middle class. And I suspect it did not do well when it was published because no one could really, no one could really relate to it. Like, if you were a white person reading this, you were kind of just like, this is not what I was expecting from an African-American writer. And then if you were an African-American person reading this, it was probably not likely that this matched your actual experience of the world. So I think because this title character of Sarah Phillips was not particularly, she doesn't come across particularly sympathetically, that may be why this book was not more widely read. But Steve, have you read Sarah Phillips? The next book I do not have a physical copy of, but it's one that I read a couple of years ago in 2019. And this is a collection of short stories by Cyrus Colter called The Beach Umbrella and Other Stories. And Cyrus Colter was a writer, an African-American writer who was writing around the time of the Black Arts Movement, but he was not someone who was a central figure to the Black Arts Movement. So this collection of his stories was originally published in 1970. And I read it a couple of years ago and thought it was quite good and liked it. But yeah, it seems like it has very few, I think it actually has fewer than 10 reviews and ratings on Goodreads. So Steve, have you read Cyrus Colter's short story collection, The Beach Umbrella? Next to last in the poetry and prose category is one that I will talk about at a little bit more length, which is Ann Winter's 2004 poetry collection, The Displaced of Capital. This was published by University of Chicago Press. So, Steve, there is a chance that you heard about it. So Ann Winters is not a very well-known poet. She's actually only published, to my knowledge, 2 collections. One is this one, and the one before this was called The Key to the City. It came out the year I was born. So she went quite a long time in between publishing these 2 volumes. But this is an interesting volume. It deals mainly with New York City, and it deals a lot with the labor force. And I read this in a graduate level poetry seminar that was led by my dissertation director, and she really likes the title poem in here called The Mill Race, which basically talks about workers coming home at the end of the day on the bus, and there's some great lines in here like, nothing's left over really from labor, they've taken it all for the mill race. But my dissertation advisor's favorite line in here was, if there's leisure bus riders, it's not for you. And she would often say that line to us in class, or sometimes she would quote it in an email if she had a lot of stuff to tell us on email. There's leisure bus riders, it's not for you. But if you have read it or not, Steve, one poem in here that I think you will be particularly interested in, and that I actually wrote an entire seminar paper on for that particular poetry class, was the last poem in this volume called The First Verse. So most of these poems have to do with New York, and they have to do with workers and labor and capitalism and the detrimental effects of capitalism. But the very last poem in this collection, the first verse, is about the first verse of the Hebrew Bible. And it starts off by quoting what the first verse of the Bible is in Hebrew, Breshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. And then it takes each of those 7 words in turn and kind of explicates them. And it's really good. It's a really interesting poem. If you have not read it, I think you would find it quite fascinating. Hannah of Hannah's Books, I think you would also like this poem if you've never read it. So Steve, have you read The Displaced of Capital by Anne Winters? And then finally is one that I felt like sort of straddled fiction and nonfiction. And this is a book that I read not too long ago by Ruth Calderon, translated by Ilana Kurshan, called A Bride for One Night, Talmud Tales. This was originally published in Hebrew in 2001, and it was published in an English translation in 2014. And similarly to what I just described in the Anne Winters volume, Ruth Calderon here takes stories from the Talmud and then writes midrashim about them, more or less. So she gives sort of extra layers of explanation and imagining of what might have happened in those stories and fills in the gaps. So yes, Steve, have you read A Bride for One Night? So that's everything on the fiction and poetry list. I also have a list of nonfiction titles, the first of which is by Mary V. Dearborn. It is called Love in the Promised Land, The Story of Anzia, Yezierska, and John Dewey. And this is also a book that I read while I was working on my dissertation, because this is the only volume that I'm aware of, at least this is the only volume that existed when I was working on this chapter back in 2015, 2016, that treats the secret romance between Anzia Yezierska and John Dewey. This volume was originally published in 1988, and it was not published by like a university press or anything like that. And the whole romantic relationship between Dewey and Yezierska has, there have been a lot of things said about it, and biographers of John Dewey, like say Robert Westbrook, have tended to overlook it entirely or ignore it or make it seem like it was all in Yezierska's head. But Dewey actually wrote her a number of poems, romantic poems. And so even though it seems like, based on what I've read and also on Yezierska's own accounts and fictionalizations of this relationship, it was likely never consummated sexually. They probably kissed, and it was like a very intense emotional affair, but that was probably about the extent of it. But it was something that heavily influenced Yezierska's own writing after it happened. And she kept, again, sort of returning to this relationship and creating fictionalized versions of it in her work over and over again. So Steve, have you read Love in the Promised Land? Another book in my nonfiction list is Karen Kelsky's The Professor is In. Now, this I picked because it's kind of niche. Karen Kelsky runs a blog of the same title called The Professor is In, and she essentially gives advice to newly minted PhDs or PhD candidates who are going on to the job market about how to land a tenure track job. And so she took her advice and published it in a book form. And again, it is kind of niche. I mean, even when I was still a PhD candidate, this was not a book that was widely known about. I mean, some people knew about it and some people knew about the Professor is In blog, but I think unless you were like in academia specifically, this would be an easy title to overlook. So Steve, have you read Karen Kelsky's The Professor is In? Next book on my nonfiction list is Iain Johnstone's biography of Meryl Streep, Streep, A Life in Film. And this was originally published in 2009. It was published by Psychology News Press, and I think this originally came out in the UK. It was hailed as the first biography of Meryl Streep in 20 years, and I will say, having read it, it's not a great biography. But Steve, have you read this biography of Meryl Streep? All right. Next book is one that I myself read recently and really disliked, which is Merle Feld's A Spiritual Life, A Jewish Feminist Journey. This was, in fact, published by SUNY Press, so it did come out of a state university press, but I assume it was probably a small run and mostly a vanity project for how much I disliked it and how poor the organization was overall. But Steve, have you read Merle Feld's A Spiritual Life? Number 5 on the nonfiction list is a book that I bought for a course in technical design in graduate school because while I concentrated my studies in American pragmatism, 20th century African American literature, and 20th century Jewish American literature, I also got a graduate certificate in technical communication. So in my class on document design, we read this book by Brian Dougherty called Green Graphic Design. It was originally published in 2008. And basically talks about green design in practice, and how you can achieve green design in a number of ways. So, Steve, have you read this book about green design? Number 6 on my list of nonfiction titles. This is at my office, so I don't have it here. But it's Brittany Cooper, Susanna Morris, and Robin Boy Lawrence Crunk Feminist collection, which came out in 2017 and is a collection of blog posts from the Crunk Feminist Collective website. So I read this last year, quite liked it. But Steve, have you read the Crunk Feminist collection? Okay, and then the last 2 nonfiction titles on this list, I'm actually fairly confident that Steve has read, but I'm going to just throw them in anyway because I feel like the point of this is to talk about lesser known titles in your library. So one of these is Anuradha Bhagwati. Lord, I cannot say this poor woman's name. Anuradha Bhagwati's Unbecoming, a Memoir of Disobedience. So Bhagwati was the founder of SWAN, the Service Women's Action Network, which deals with helping survivors of sexual assault in the military. This memoir of hers was published in 2019, and I will say it's a book that would not have made it onto my radar had I not been given it as a gift by someone. But I did read it, and it was interesting. I thought the first half of it was better than the second half because the first half is sort of more concerned with the author's own feelings and experiences as she decided to join the Marines and then went through training and eventually became a Marine, but then it kind of stopped centering her own feelings and experiences, and then at some point became kind of a blow-by-blow account of, then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. So that I found less interesting, but it is an interesting story overall. And again, I strongly suspect that Steve has read this, but I figured I would mention it anyway. And then the last book, I would be shocked if Steve has not read this, but I'm going to mention it because it was the bane of my existence in graduate school. This is Joan Richardson's A Natural History of Pragmatism, published by Cambridge University Press in 2007. So this is a book that I was first introduced to in my graduate seminar on American pragmatism that I took in 2010, and my dissertation director loves this book. I don't know why, but she loves it. And this also then made it onto my comprehensive exams reading list for American pragmatism. Ugh. So, yes, this book has tormented me. And, I say that because I'm someone who, I studied American pragmatism extensively, and yet I pick up this book to read it, and it's I still don't know what she's talking about half the time. And again, I have a degree in this particular subject, so if I'm specializing in this, and even I don't know what Joan Richardson is talking about half the time because she's just pulling in quotes and references from all these sources without telling you what they are, that's a big problem. So Steve, have you read this book, and do you find it as infuriating as I do? So that's it. That's my whole list of books that I want to know if Steve Donahue has read. So thank you for watching this. If you have thoughts about any of these books, please do let me know that down in the comments below. I hope everyone is staying healthy and well. I hope you're doing good reading whatever you're reading. And until next time, would it kill you to call you mother?